Wow, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out to support the National Civil War Museum and me for my talk this afternoon. All of you honor me, and I appreciate it very much. Happy to be here. I always say, when people say, Wayne, how are you going to get introduced? I said, there's only two things I ever want in my introduction when I ask for an introduction. And since I'm doing it myself, isn't this great? I get what I want to put in. So I always say that I'm the CEO of the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg, one of the largest museums in the country dedicated to preserving and telling the story of the Civil War. The greatest day of my professional career was the day 7 years ago in April that I was asked to come up here and join this wonderful museum team of the board, the staff, and all the volunteers here at the National Civil War Museum. Best day of my professional career when I got to do that. And also, the second thing I always tell everyone is this is my 31st anniversary as a licensed guide at Gettysburg National Military Center. And my only goal is to get to 50. I tell everybody, this is your goal. I'm going to get to 50. There's chairs around, folks. I think there's probably some seats in between. I think we've got every chair out, so I apologize if folks have to stand. Thank you. Standing room only. It's great. I appreciate a couple chairs back in the corner back there. That's great. Go right ahead. Make your way over there. This was a very interesting topic for me to explore. And I first of all want to say I'm honored to be part of our lecture series. So this is the second of 12 lectures. We will have one next month. I'll tell you about that at the end of the program. And usually in the wintertime, we ask the staff to conduct these lectures. Why do we do that? Because if you're coming from Colorado and it's the middle of December and it snows, that's a problem. But if you're Wayne Motts and you're nearby, it's not so much of a problem. Or Brent, our curator. So usually the staff tries to do the winter programs. And we've got an exciting lineup for you this year. This is the first time that I've ever given this presentation to a group. So I hope you'll all be patient. I hope you'll all bear with me. This journey about the topic we're going to talk about this afternoon started in before 2015. In 2015, my co-author, Jim Hessler, licensed battlefield guide, sitting back here in the back row, he and I put together a book as a guide to Pickett's Charge, and one of the men we're going to talk about today is an officer that served in the Union Army on the peninsula and then changed sides and died as a Confederate officer in Pickett's Charge. So the idea of this program came about because in doing research for the book, one of our deceased colleagues, late battlefield guide John Volbrick, said, Wayne, I met this person that has a photograph of this man and his story. So we have photographs of that gentleman, and we're able to tell more about the story. So that's how I got interested in the topic. Changing sides, I think everybody thinks that changing sides in the Civil War, ladies and gentlemen, is something new. And it isn't new. We're going to talk a little bit about it. But before we do, I want to show you the picture on the front cover of the slide. The flag on the left is the original garrison flag, the United States garrison flag on the left of the slide here of Fort Sumter. And that photograph, as poor as it is, was taken by myself and my wife Tina, who I'm honored to have her with us today. She's in the back here, doing the video and all the other things that need to be done. At Fort Sumter, that's the original garrison flag of Fort Sumter that we took an image of in 2013 at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor for the start of the Civil War. The flag on the right is a Confederate flag that flew over Fort Sumter that is upstairs in our gallery here at the National Civil War Museum. So really, the talk today is under two flags, blue and gray, the men who fought on both sides in the Civil War, and it's not unusual. I'm going to give you two examples from history. One of these examples you have probably never heard of, and the other example you probably know very well. So here are the two examples. The one on the right, everybody knows Benedict Arnold. You can see that back there, everybody. Benedict Arnold on the right of the slide here obviously changed sides. This is an American officer in the Revolutionary War, wanted to give up West Point. His plot was detected. He changed sides to fight with the British, and he died in London, England. And the man on the left of the slide is Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish historian in the Great Jewish Revolt of 66 to 70 A.D. He was a commander of Jewish troops in Jerusalem. He changed sides and fought with the Romans, and he is the man, as a historian, that writes a lot of the history of the Great Jewish Revolt between 66 and 70. We call it AD. Today they call it Common Era. CE, Common Era. We call it AD. But anyway, these are two famous men, fought on opposite sides and changed sides. So none of this, I would say, is new, ladies and gentlemen. Now, let's also talk about the 5 men that I'm going to talk about today. And the 5 men that I'm going to speak of are 5 that I picked out. They're not the only 5. The galvanized Yankees are a term that some of you in this room may have heard. Who are they? The galvanized Yankees were a group of individuals. They were generally Confederate prisoners recruited out of Confederate POW or out of Union POW camps, and then they were organized into 6 volunteer regiments, and they were sent west to fight the Indians during the Civil War. So they galvanized in the term that they wore both uniforms. They started in gray, they ended up in a POW camp, they took the oath of allegiance to the United States, and they changed to blue uniforms, and there's probably 6,000 men that actually did that. And then there's probably 1,600 Union prisoners that changed sides and fought for the Confederates. And those men were mostly foreign-born, many of them immigrants in this country. So the 5 men that I chose today, with one exception, were not prisoners of war. They changed sides under interesting circumstances. That's why I chose them. And they're not prisoners, except for one exception that I'm going to talk about today, that we would term as the galvanized Yankees. So there's a whole group, or whole groups of people, that decided it was better to change sides fighting the uniform than it is to spend time in a POW camp. And those are not the people that we're going to talk about today. But what might surprise you is it's not that uncommon for people to change sides, either in the Civil War or anywhere else. And the 5 men that I'm going to profile today, I sure hope I spelled things right. If I didn't, they're all my mistakes. The 5 men, and I'll try to read it for some of you that may have time to see the slides over here. Richard Kidder Meade, Manning Kimmel, Joseph Sanders, Douglas Stith, and William Thomas Magruder. So these are 5 men that I chose, and I'm the person that chose them. 4 of the men went from Union to Confederate. One of these 5 men went from a Confederate soldier to be a Union soldier. 2 of the men died in the war. That would be Meade and Magruder. And 3 of the men came from border states, which I find interesting. So you're thinking to yourself, why would these men change sides? Well, first of all, 3 of these men, 2 of them came from the state of Maryland. Maryland didn't officially leave the Union. 1 of them came from the state of Missouri, which also didn't officially leave the Union. So you're kind of thinking to yourself, what motivates these soldiers to write out their resignation letters? Sometimes it depends on when your state, if you're a Virginian, leaves the Union. You're waiting to figure out, what's Virginia going to do? I think that's the case with at least 1 of these men. 3 of the 5 of these men that are on here are from border states. 1 of the men was born in South Carolina and lived in Georgia. So I actually came from the deep South. And just in looking at this, I found it very interesting. 4 of the men were graduates of West Point. 4 of them were officers in the Union Army, regular Army, and then they changed sides, and the 4 men became officers in the Confederate Army under different circumstances that are here. So all of them are officers, and I did look and looked at their social economic. I tried to figure out, first of all, were these men, did they come from slaveholding families? And at least 3 of these men, as far as I can determine, they themselves might not have personally owned slaves, but their families owned slaves. And that includes people from, as I mentioned, Maryland and also Missouri, which might explain some of this, but I don't think it actually explains all of it. One of the biggest questions we're going to ask ourselves today is, why did these men do it? Why did they determine to change sides? And in some ways, that question will go unanswered, but I'm going to give you some thoughts on it, because these men did not sit down and write out specifically and tell us specifically, hey, I changed sides for this specific purpose. 2 of them died in the war, so we don't have a lot regarding them, and 1 of them, under very strange circumstances, may have even been a spy. We'll talk a little bit about that, one of the reasons why we chose it. These aren't the only 5 men that changed sides in the Civil War. There are 5 that I just chose to profile here. So let's talk about Richard Kidder Meade, the first of our 5 men. This is a great image from the West Point Library of Richard Kidder Meade. 2 of these men, 2 of the 5, are graduates of the West Point class of 1857. Guess what year they started to photograph for the class photo album? 1857. Isn't that great for us? Sometimes you have to be lucky. So we have images of these men. Ironically, of the 4 men, 2 of them were in the class of 1857, 2 of them are in the class of 1850. So 2 of these classes have 2 men that decided to change sides. Richard Kidder Meade, I do not believe that Richard Kidder Meade is related to George Gordon Meade. That's the Philadelphia Meades. These are the Virginia Meades. And he is the son of Richard Kidder Meade. Now, Richard Kidder Meade was the ambassador to Brazil under President Franklin Buchanan. So his father was an attorney, his father was a politician, his father was very, very well connected, and also had businesses in numerous different locations. Richard Kidder Meade was one of 8 children. He was appointed to West Point in 1853, and he graduates in the class of 1857. That is the same class that Marcus Reno, who fought at the Battle of Little Bighorn, is part of. The same class that E. Porter Alexander is part of. George Strong, who was killed at Morris Island, South Carolina. And one of the other men that we're going to talk about, Manning Kimmel, who also changed sides. They're classmates together for the class of 1857. Now, Richard Kidder Meade graduates second in his class, and when he graduates, he's going to be held at West Point because of how good he is as an instructor there. And he will stay there until he's posted to New York Harbor to take care of defenses. All of the top graduates of West Point, you're in the top 1 or 2 in your class. You are an engineering officer. So these men are going to be part of an engineering corps. And this man will be at New York Harbor, and then in November of 1860, who could say lousy timing, right? November 1860, let's go to Charleston, South Carolina. Let's get posted to Fort Sumter. Of course, Abraham Lincoln's elected president early in November of 1860, and on December 20th, 1860, South Carolina will leave the Union. So Richard Kidder Meade is an engineering officer actually inside Fort Sumter when Fort Sumter is bombarded. He is wearing a Union uniform inside Fort Sumter during a bombardment and is in combat action there. Now, he's going to resign on May 1st. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And 7 days later, he's commissioned as a Confederate engineer for the state of Virginia. And he will be on the peninsula in action with the Confederate Army there. And he'll be in New Bern, North Carolina. And then on June 8th, 1862, he is sent to James Longstreet. Will be part of General Longstreet's command on the Virginia Peninsula during George McClellan's Peninsula Campaign. He will die of disease in July of 1862. So he's only in his early 20s, mid-20s at the time of the American Civil War. Now, he's sent down to Fort Sumter. You all know the story of Fort Sumter. Here is an image of Fort Sumter right at the turn of the century that's here. This is a fort in Charleston Harbor that guards the approaches to the Charleston Harbor. And here are the officers that were assigned to it, and I've circled in yellow Richard Kidder Meade. He's right here. Everybody on the left-hand side here is Abner Doubleday, the legendary founder of baseball. I'm sure all of you know. He's an officer at Fort Sumter. Major Robert Anderson, a Kentucky-born commander of the Fort Sumter garrison. And this man right here is Samuel Wiley Crawford, who fought at Gettysburg as a surgeon inside Fort Sumter. He had, anybody know what the colors of the medical corps are in the Union Army and the U.S. Regular Army? Green, right? Green's a color. So what did Brett Kelly lay out for us today? The actual jacket that I think is in that photograph that belonged to Samuel Wiley Crawford. Right there it is. And that's Samuel Wiley Crawford's sash, and that is in the collection, ladies and gentlemen, nowhere else in the whole world but here at the National Civil War Museum. Right here. So you get a double bonus. Samuel Wiley Crawford from Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, our surgeon at Fort Sumter. So these are the pictures of the 9 officers. This was taken, I'm not sure exactly when the photograph was taken, but the photograph was reproduced in Harper's Weekly newspaper on March 23rd, 1861. So right before the firing on Fort Sumter, this photograph is turned into a woodcut. And here's the young Richard Kidder Meade in the back row, second from the right, right there. Now, where is this? Well, here's what it looks like. Here's Fort Sumter in the center of Charleston Harbor. Here is downtown Charleston, and obviously if you want to get shipping in and out of Charleston, you've got to sail past Fort Sumter. Now there is a little fort called Castle Pinckney at the outskirts of Charleston, about a half a mile or so off of the Charleston coast. It is closer to the Charleston as a city than Fort Sumter is. The problem is the U.S. garrison that is here is over here at Fort Moultrie, and the day after Christmas, on December 26, 1860, Robert Anderson is going to move his garrison from Fort Moultrie, South Carolina, over inside Fort Sumter. So he thinks that he can garrison it. This is an artillery unit in the fort, batteries E and H of the 1st United States Artillery Regiment under Doubleday's command, who becomes a volunteer general. Well, here's a little Castle Pinckney about a half a mile off of Charleston. It's got armament. It's a small place, but they don't have, the Union forces don't have enough men to send out there to garrison it. So Richard Kidder Meade is given an order, get out to Castle Pinckney, take 30 workmen out there, and try to train them to work these guns. Well, once the governor of South Carolina learns that Robert Anderson has taken this garrison from Fort Moultrie over to Fort Sumter, he's furious because he thinks he's got a pledge from President Buchanan not to reinforce or supply any of these forts. So the Confederates want to get a hold of this place. Not only do they want to get Fort Sumter, they want to get Castle Pinckney, which is very close. How many people are assigned to Castle Pinckney? One man. He's an ordnance sergeant with his family living inside Castle Pinckney. So on December 27, 1860, that is just a week after South Carolina left the Union, the governor of South Carolina, Francis Pickens, is going to tell one of his aides, I want you to take a detachment out to Castle Pinckney, and I want that to surrender. And of course, who's there? Richard Kidder Meade, our young lieutenant, who's a graduate of West Point, with 30 workmen, and he has no defensive troops to defend this place. This is Castle Pinckney. Now, this is a 2013 image of it, flying an Irish flag in recognition of Irish immigration. This is what it looked like when my wife and I toured Charleston in 2013. This was bought by the Sons of Confederate Veterans in 2011 for $10. And I don't know if the Civil War Trust right now has plans to try to save it, but it's in a very dilapidated state. If you went out to Castle Pinckney, you can't really go out there. I know few people that have ever been there. I have never set foot on Castle Pinckney, but it is extremely difficult to get out to it. And Richard Kidder Meade is there a week after the surrender at Fort Sumter. Governor Pickens says, we want it. Take a detachment of troops, go out and get it. Where's he going to get the troops from? There's a little military college in Charleston called the Citadel, right? And this is where the troops are going to come from. And the man who actually is the aide to Governor Pickens, all my Gettysburg guys here in the room know who he is, James Johnson Pettigrew. James Johnson Pettigrew was North Carolina born, but he's been living in South Carolina. He was an attorney, a graduate of the University of North Carolina, and he is the aide to Governor Pickens. And Governor Pickens says, go out there and take care of this place. Now, we have documentation from this. Admiral Doubleday's journal, Samuel Wiley Crawford, his diary. There's documentation that talk about what went on here. So on December 27th, in the afternoon, this man, James Johnson Pettigrew, is going to take a detachment of troops from the Citadel out to Castle Pinckney. And here's Richard Kidder Meade in his 20s with 30 workmen out there. And we have sort of what the exchange leads to. The seizure, and this is Admiral Doubleday writing in 1876. This is what he said. The seizure of Castle Pinckney on the afternoon of the 27th was the first overt act of succession against the sovereignty of the United States. At 2 p.m., the Washington Light Artillery and the Marhar Guards, both companies of Colonel Pettigrew's rifle regiment, embarked under the command of an officer aboard the Nina, a steamer, and settled in on the island. When they arrived in front of the main gate, they found it closed, whereupon they applied scaling ladders and with eager flushed faces made their way to the top of the wall. This is at Castle Pinckney. The excitement was needless for three. There was no one to resist him. The only fighting men present were Lieutenant Richard Kidder Meade, of the engineers and Ordnance Sergeant Skillen, who resided there with his family and who was in charge. Meade himself was a Virginian and had a sharp colloquy with Pettigrew and expressed himself in the severest terms in retaliation for this treasonable assault upon Castle Pinckney. After taking possession, one of the rebel officers found the sergeant's pretty daughter, Kate Skillen, age 15, weeping bitterly at the foot of the ramparts, and he assured her no harm would befall her. Her reply was, "I'm not crying because I'm afraid. What's the matter then? I'm crying because you put up that miserable rag." And she pointed to the Palmetto flag, which had just been raised to the top of the staff. Kate Skillen marries a battery commander that fights at the Battle of Gettysburg, and his name is William Harn. Harn's battery. This is a battery on the Taneytown Road, right near the cyclorama, 3rd New York Artillery for the Gettysburg Guides. This 15-year-old girl marries William Harn, because William Harden, who fought at the Battle of Gettysburg, was a member of the Fort Sumter garrison. Guess how they met? So Richard Kidder Meade is out there. He's got 30 workmen. They're hiding underneath the desk. And Pettigrew is saying, "You got to surrender." So what's Meade do? He leaves. He goes back to Fort Sumter and he talks to Richard Anderson. And Castle Pinckney, inside Fort Sumter, is taken. Now Meade will leave. He will actually leave Fort Sumter on the 18th of January. Doubleday says it's on the 18th of January that Richard Kidder Meade leaves. So he's here on December 27th. This young lieutenant gets word that his sister is ill in Petersburg, Virginia. So he gets a leave of absence and he immediately goes around the 18th, that's the date given, of January. This is before the firing on Fort Sumter. And he goes up to Washington, D.C. Now, why is he going to go there first? Because guess what? The Secretary of War, all the military officials, they want to get a first-hand account. Hey, what's going on down there at Fort Sumter? Richard Kidder Meade goes to Petersburg, Virginia, and he is there, and he returns to Fort Sumter on January 24th, 1861. Now, Abner Doubleday, writing in 1876, doesn't know a lot of the circumstances. Here's what he says about it. Quote, "On the 18th, Lieutenant Meade left us for his home in Richmond," actually it's Petersburg, "in consequence of a dispatch which stated that his mother was at the point of death. I never knew whether this telegram was founded on fact or was a strategic move to force poor Meade into the ranks of the Confederacy, but detaching him from us and taking him where tremendous political and social influences could be brought to bear on him." So basically, Doubleday is saying, we send him home to Petersburg, all his family is going to be telling him, you need to resign. So Doubleday thinks that this may be a ruse. He also mentions that Meade's mother is ill, and it's not his mother, it's actually Meade's sister. And Meade's sister dies January 24th, 1861, in Petersburg, the very day he returns to Fort Sumter. So this story is actually true. He did have a sick family member. It wasn't his mother, it was his sister. And he does get leave, goes back to Petersburg, is with her, but he has to leave right before she dies. And he returns to the garrison at Fort Sumter. Now, fast forward to April 12, 1861. What happens at 4:30 a.m.? Fort Sumter is fired upon by the Confederate forces. We call it the start of the American Civil War. And that bombardment goes for 34 hours. Who's inside the fort? Richard Kidder Meade, native of Virginia, West Point graduate. When that fort surrenders, Richard Kidder Meade gets on the steamer, goes up to New York, and he makes his way to Washington, D.C., where he writes out, ladies and gentlemen, his resignation. This is Richard Kidder Meade's resignation. And it dates to the 29th of April. It's 2 weeks after the firing on Fort Sumter. And he says, that he wants to wait for it to take effect on May 1st, 1861. Now, why does he leave? Once Fort Sumter's fired upon, once it surrenders, Abraham Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. The states in the Upper South are upset about that. And what does Virginia do? She votes a secession convention to leave the Union on the 17th of April. And the people themselves vote on the 23rd of May. So the 17th of April, the secession convention in Richmond says we're going to leave, and Richard Kidder Meade is actually signing this out on the 29th to take effect on May 1st. So I think Richard Kidder Meade is waiting to leave because he wants to see where his own state is going to go. This isn't South Carolina, but this is Virginia. So it's clear to me that the reason why he decides to wait is he's looking to see what Virginia will do. Then Richard Kidder Meade will be assigned as a staff officer to the various people that we talked about on the peninsula. He's with James Longstreet on June 8, 1862. Then he goes back to Petersburg, and he dies on July 31st, 1862, in his 20s. This is the Meade plot at the Old Blandford Cemetery in Petersburg. His father dies in April of 1862. His brother dies at the beginning of July of 1862 of disease in the Civil War, and he dies of disease on July 31st. And his sister dies in 1861. So this poor mother is going to bury her husband, is going to bury her daughter, and bury two of her sons that fought in the Civil War, all because of disease. So Richard Kidder Meade actually dies of disease. So here's a guy in combat action on both sides in the Civil War as a Union officer inside Fort Sumter when it's being bombarded. Then he changes sides and joins the Confederacy. So you got to ask yourself, what's going through his head when that's going on? Here's a classmate of his, Manning Kimmel. Kimmel is an 1857 graduate of the United States Military Academy. He's born in Perry County, Missouri. His father, Singleton Husband Kimmel. This man was a very prominent merchant. He had stores in St. Louis, in New York, in Philadelphia, and Manning's mother died in childbirth. So his mother, Caroline, died having him. And then Singleton Husband Kimmel marries a woman from Philadelphia, and she is a Gorgas. I think she is related to General Gorgas, the ordnance officer in the Confederate Army, who has to be a native of Lancaster and the Philadelphia area. So very prominent family, slave-holding family from the state of Missouri, graduated 22nd out of a class, of course, and who's number 2 in the class? Richard Kidder Meade, that you just saw, his friend. So now we got a Missourian that's here. He graduates from the West Point class and assigned to the 2nd United States Cavalry Regiment, and that regiment is in Texas. Who are officers in that unit? Albert Sidney Johnston, Robert E. Lee, some very prominent people that are there, and he's serving fighting the Comanches. Then they bring this regiment, the 2nd Cavalry from the West, and it fights at the First Battle of Bull Run. So if you're Manning Kimmel, you're in a Union officer's uniform with G Company, 2nd United States Cavalry Regiment. Our friend Jim Hessler. Who else is an officer that just shows up on the battlefield at Bull Run with G Company, 2nd United States Infantry Regiment? Is it not George Armstrong Custer? Isn't Custer serving in that company? I think these men are serving in the same company at the Battle of Bull Run. George Armstrong Custer, a new 1861 graduate of West Point, and Manning Kimmel. Both of them in the 2nd United States Cavalry Regiment fighting at the Battle of Bull Run. Then he's going to resign his commission in August of 1861. Now, hey, remember, Missouri hasn't left the Union. You can figure out, I'm from a slave-holding family, what I'm going to do. But this is a case where this man is actually commanding Union troops against Confederates at Bull Run. And then he decides to change sides. He is appointed to the staff of Ben McCulloch and Earl Van Dorn. Earl Van Dorn was a Confederate commander out in Mississippi and in Tennessee. On May 7th, 1863, Earl Van Dorn is sitting at his desk. Manning Kimmel is his chief secretary. And on May 7th, 1863, a jealous husband who thinks that Earl Van Dorn is having an affair with his wife goes in and shoots him dead at the desk where he is. Earl Van Dorn apparently liked to ride with this lady in question, and one reporter said that Earl Van Dorn was the terror of ugly husbands. The terror of ugly husbands. That's how Earl Van Dorn is described. Manning Kimmel is at Earl Van Dorn's office when Earl Van Dorn is basically assassinated by this doctor that thinks that Earl Van Dorn is having an affair with his wife. The verdict is still out on that, whether he is or he isn't. And then he's transferred to John Bowie Magruder's staff. After the war, he goes to Mexico and then he settles in Henderson, Kentucky. He dies in 1916. This is his resignation letter, and it is from Louisville, Kentucky, and it dates to August 14th, as we just mentioned. And he says right here, enclosed is the letter of my father, which will explain itself. So why does Manning Kimmel fight for the Union forces at Bull Run and then change sides in August? There is a letter inside his file at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. that actually has from Cape Giroux, Missouri, that's in southeast Missouri, and he basically says to his son, this is a letter from Singleton husband Kimmel to his son, that says that he's dying of cancer. And he doesn't think he's going to last very long, and he wants his son to resign his Army commission, come to Missouri, and settle his estate, which he thinks is going to take 2 to 3 years to do it. That's what this letter actually says. He says, I'm not long to this earth. This letter was written August 10th, 1861. When does S.H. Kimmel die? 1868. Now, hang on though. What's he die of? Dies of cancer of the face. And this letter says that he's been suffering for cancer for many years. So is it possible that Singleton husband Kimmel wrote to his son and said, look, I need help here, come settle this estate? Yeah, that's possible. However, it's not going to be long after he resigns. He resigns on May 1st. When does he get his first job as an engineer with the Confederacy? May 8th. 7 days. Manning marries Kimmel has some very famous relatives. This might shock some of you in this room. You want to know who his famous relatives are? How about his son and his grandson? Here they are, right here. Recognize this man? Yes. This is Admiral Husband Kimmel, the commander of the entire Pacific Fleet when Pearl Harbor was bombed, is the son of this man that fought on both sides during the Civil War. And this is his grandson and namesake, Lieutenant Commander Manning Marius Kimmel, who died commanding a submarine in the Philippines in 1944. Both of these men are graduates of the United States Naval Academy. And this man had other sons. He had 2 other sons in service as well. So Manning Marius Kimmel from Missouri, United States cavalry soldier and Missouri staff officer in the war, is the father to Admiral Husband Kimmel. There's a statue to him in Henderson, Kentucky, which is where Kimmel settled after his Civil War career. He married a girl from Henderson, Kentucky, on the Ohio River. It's here. And of course, this man lost at sea. His body was never recovered. So here's 2 of them. All right. This is probably, I think he's the most interesting story I've got today, and unfortunately we don't have a photograph of this officer. We're going to find him sooner or later. I had friends in Texas looking for it. Donald Chester Stitt was born July 21st, 1829. Yes, that's right, folks, in Smyrna, Turkey. Turkey. He's actually born in Turkey. Today it's Izmir, Turkey, and his father was a merchant and was living on the Aegean Sea on the east coast of Turkey, I think, west coast of Turkey, I guess, until they went back to Baltimore. So, this man, born in Turkey, grows up most of his early years in Turkey and then in Baltimore, and his father dies in 1838 at age 47. So, young Donald is 9 years old when his father dies. He graduates from West Point, spelled that wrong there, last in his class, assigned to the 5th Infantry, and is in Oklahoma, Texas, and New Mexico during the American Civil War. And he's given a special mission while he's in New Mexico to go down and visit the governor of Chihuahua because there had been some wagons stolen that the U.S. government wants to get some information on. And the circumstances of Donald Chester Stitt going to the Confederacy is something even today nobody really knows what happened here. But I'm going to give you some of what we know. So here he is, all the way up here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and he gets with a small party of men and goes all the way down crosses the border down into Mexico, and gets south of the border with a small party of men on his way to Chihuahua. Now, folks, from Santa Fe, New Mexico to Chihuahua is like 800 miles. It's 355 miles from Santa Fe down to Fort Bliss, which is in the corner of Texas on the Rio Grande. So Stitt is serving, at that time, he's a first lieutenant in the 5th United States Infantry Regiment, and he's got a small party of men heading down to Chihuahua, Mexico, and he's down there, and this is the report that he writes a couple days after the action in July of 1861. Here's what he says. Sir, I have the honor to report the information of my commanding officer at the Department of Mexico, the circumstances connected with my arrest and being brought to this place. That's Fort Bliss, Texas. While on my way to Chihuahua, in pursuit of instructions from the department, having proceeded as a mile below the town of Guadalupe, Mexico, 40 miles from El Paso, when I was encamped there, a party of 12 to 15 men in number came up representing himself, the officer in charge, as Lieutenant Adams, and told me he had orders to take me to Fort Bliss. I asked him by what authority. He replied, by the authority of the Southern Confederacy. Here is a Confederate party in Mexico trying to capture him. Okay? Now he says, look, I told him I don't recognize any such power, and that it was a violation of law of nations, there I being on foreign soil. He replied that he was under the commanding orders of Colonel Baylor, and as I did not have sufficient enough force to resist him, I obeyed the order under protest and was brought to this place together with those who had accompanied me the whole way from Fort Fillmore, it's in New Mexico, and I've got it on the map, that's there. I was brought into the presence of Colonel Baylor, who told me that I was a prisoner of war. I told him the circumstances of the same that I told Lieutenant Adams, saying that I acknowledged no such power of the Southern Confederacy and that it was a violation of the soil of Mexico. And he replied that he'd not given any orders for my arrest, but as long as I had been brought to this garrison, he did not see fit to release me. He then ordered my parole, which I signed, the only alternative being close confinement. And so here he is. He's inside Fort Bliss, Texas, after being captured by Confederates 40 miles below the border in Mexico. So he gets up to Fort Bliss, Texas, and then in September of 1861, where is he? This is July of 1861. 2 months later, he's in a Confederate uniform as a Confederate staff officer at San Antonio, Texas. So the question becomes, what happened? Did he get turned? Was it already set up? Edward S. Canby, the department commander, he says, here's a picture of John Baylor. He's the Southern commander, Texas cavalry leader in the area. This is what Edward Canby says. Here's his resolution. This is interesting. This is a letter received by the adjutant general where Colonel Baylor, he's the Confederate commander, writing to Edward Canby, the Union commander, and he basically says that Lieutenant Stiss had given his resignation letter to this Confederate officer, John Baylor, and John Baylor gave it to a courier who destroyed it, a bearer who destroyed it. Because guess what? Captain Stitt, who later becomes a captain, he doesn't have a resignation letter in the National Archives. If you're in the U.S. government, you think this guy is a traitor because you don't have any letter of resignation on record. This letter says, from Colonel Baylor to Colonel Canby, the commander, Department of Mexico, that letter of resignation was in his possession, Colonel Baylor's, given to destroyed by the courier. And he says it's an injustice to Captain Stitt that he doesn't have a letter of resignation. Well, guess what? You're in the U.S. Army, you don't have a letter of resignation, and you just change sides. Guess what they're going to do? They're going to kick you out. And that's exactly what they do. They dismiss him from the Army. First thing they got to do is they got to put this up the long chain of command in the Army. Here's a picture of Edward Canby, killed by the Modoc Indians in 1873, not long after this. And right here, this entire write-up is for Edward Canby. It is in his own hand. It's very difficult to read. But what does it say? I have but little doubt now that it was part of an arranged matter. So he's saying, writing in December of 1861, I think this was all set up. And Captain Stitt got to Mexico and then didn't change sides here. We will never know for sure. We will never know whether Captain Stitt was a spy, or did he just talk to these people? Captain Stitt's from Baltimore. His family at one time owned slaves. Guess what? We're going to change sides. What did they promise him? We don't know. This is his dismissal in published orders from the Army. So on April 3rd, 1862, by direction of the President, Captain Stitt is dismissed as an officer in the 5th United States Cavalry Regiment, or 5th United States Infantry Regiment, to take effect from September 25th. That's because in September 1861, he's sitting in a Confederate uniform at a desk in San Antonio, Texas, everybody. Now, interesting circumstantial evidence about this man. I sent some friends down to the Texas State Cemetery in Austin, where this man is buried. I said, I want to get a picture of his grave. His grave is over there on the right. You saw it in the first slide. Very simple. What's very interesting about this, and maybe we can read something into this, is that when Captain Stitt died, he died in a Confederate home in Austin, Texas, having lived in Texas since 1877. So after the Civil War, he goes to Texas, where he dies in 1920, the last surviving member of the 1850 class of the United States Military Academy. When he dies at the Confederate home, March 18, 1920, he is not buried with the rest of the Confederate soldiers that are buried in the Confederate plot at the State Cemetery in Austin. This is what all the Confederate stones look like. This is what Stitt's stone looks like. And you'll see it's the same stone, but he's not buried with all the other Confederates. Where did they choose to bury him? Now, this is a man that was a teacher and a real estate agent from 1877 up until his death, when he was physically able to do that. He's not a politician. He's not the president of Texas. Where do they put him? They put him in the Texas State Cemetery in the same section where the founders of Texas are. He's right next to, virtually, Stephen Austin's grave. The grave behind him is the grandson of the founder of Dartmouth University and a Texas Ranger. So when this man died in 1920, why didn't they put him all the way over here? They gave him the same stone. Why didn't they put him with the rest of the Confederates? Why did they put him where all the founders of Texas are buried? And if we can answer that question, we know why he changed sides. We can't answer that question. But I'm telling you, that's unusual. Even the people in the cemetery thought it was unusual. So why is he given a place of honor there when he was a teacher and a real estate agent? Could be a lot of stuff going on there that we don't particularly know about. I think he's probably the most interesting story today, because it is possible that Captain Stitt, he later became a colonel for Stephen D. Lee. He was on Stephen D. Lee's staff. I think it's possible that he could have been a spy. Could have, but there's no evidence of that. And that stuff is not going to come out later. Obviously, that's a traitorous activity there. But he is buried up here with the founders of Texas, which is interesting. Now, this is probably the man we know the least about. He is the only non-West Point graduate on this list today of 5 men. And he is the only one of 5 that went from the Confederate Army to the Union Army. This is believed to be him, put by one of his relatives on Ancestry. We're not quite sure, but Joseph Gann Sanders. Sanders was born in South Carolina. He was 33 years old. We don't even know the actual date of his birth. And he lived in a small town in southeast Alabama, Newton, Alabama. These are the same county areas where the famed 15th Alabama, that fought on Little Round Top against Joshua Chamberlain. It's where they're recruited from. The same area that's here. He enlisted in Grenville, Alabama on October 5th, 1861, and enlisted as a captain of Company C of the 31st Georgia, from Alabama, but it goes to Georgia Infantry Regiment, and this is a unit in John Brown Gordon's brigade in the Battle of Gettysburg, fighting at Barlow's Knoll on July 1st, 1863. This man was at Gettysburg. He had been wounded at Sharpsburg. He fights at Gettysburg, and then he resigns from the service on January 29th, 1864, and according to the sources we have, Clement Evans, the colonel of this unit, says that it would be better for the service if Captain Sanders resigns. So we don't know what that's all about, but we know the colonel doesn't like it. And when the colonel doesn't like it, there's not very much you're going to be able to do. So he's going to resign from the service, and he'll go back to Alabama, Dale County, and then on June 5th, 1864, so he's back in the county not long, he goes to Fort Baracus, Florida, that's 175 miles away at Pensacola, and he joins the first Union Florida county. He's commissioned as a second lieutenant and then becomes a captain. He is a wheelwright by trade and profession, and part of Company F of the 1st Florida U.S. Where does it raid? In southeast Alabama at his home. Actually raids, and they're going up against Confederate home guard men that are trying to enlist Confederate deserters, trying to enforce the Confederate draft. He is conducting troops the same place where he was with Confederate soldiers, where he recruited them. He goes back to his home, and now he's a Union cavalry officer raiding the area around his home. It appears that people there didn't forget that, because he decides, look at this, he's going to go down to Decatur County, Georgia. That's about 50 miles from Newton, Alabama. He decides he wants to start a new life. He goes to Decatur County, Georgia, and he shows up there at Georgia, and he is shot and killed inside his home while he's building a mill there on February 19, 1867. And we don't know the circumstances, the party of men that shot him. We don't know why they did that, but it appears that these are men that had served in the Confederate Army from his hometown. And last but not least, let's give you the last one on the list. This one is one that my colleague Jim and I put together for our book, William Thomas Magruder. So Magruder is an 1850 graduate of West Point. He's born in Upper Marlboro, Maryland. He graduates in the same class that we talked about with Donald Chester Stitt, our man from New Mexico, that we don't know whether he's a spy or not. They're in the same class together. And he spends time in the 1st Dragoons, which becomes the 1st Cavalry. And in 1862, he is fighting in the summer of 1862 as a Union officer in the 1st United States Cavalry Regiment on the Virginia Peninsula. His date of resignation is October 1st, 1862. There is no West Point graduate, none, that resigned later than this man did. So he is the last graduate of West Point to resign in the Civil War. Now, why does it take him all the way till October 1st, 1862 to resign? We don't know the answer to that question. He is from the state of Maryland. When is the Emancipation Proclamation issued? The Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation is issued in September of 1862, after the Battle of Antietam, to take effect January 1st, freeing slaves. So we could look at this and we could infer, well, this man's from the state of Maryland, why does he wait so long? Could say that could be a reason, but we don't know that to be a fact. We also know that this man was asked, or was nominated, I should say, was nominated to be a brigadier general in the Union Army. He was nominated, then his nomination was renominated, and then it was tabled. And he never got his promotion to brigadier general. This could be because, you know what? I'm mad because the Union side didn't give me a promotion to brigadier general in the volunteers, so guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to look for a better offer. I'm going to change sides. Could be for that reason. We don't know that for certain here, but we know that he dies a captain, the same rank he had in the U.S. Army at the Battle of Gettysburg on July 3rd, 1863. This is his diary. Now, this was unpublished till my colleague and I got a hold of it, and he talks about his children in here. He talks about Maryland in here. Notice the last entry in the diary when it's written. July 3rd, 1863. He goes across that field and he is mortally wounded along the Emmitsburg Road. This would be Ziegler's Grove. This would be Abraham Bryan, owned by a free African American in Gettysburg, his farm, and the Bryan Tenant House right here. This is a watercolor that is in the special collections of the Gettysburg College that was done in 1866. This was done 3 years after Pickett's charge. That's here. So, what happens is, he gets right up against this house. Magruder gets right up against this house, leading men from the 11th Mississippi, and he is mortally wounded in the shoulder, shot in the shoulder. He crawls right up against this house, and then he's taken to, he actually expires. Friends of his collect his belongings, and they are taken to a field hospital. So he dies pretty shortly thereafter, right in here. Some of his items end up in the hands of a captain in the 11th Mississippi Infantry Regiment, and this captain writes to Captain Magruder's wife, who is in Baltimore, Maryland, and she is able to get back some of his belongings. One thing that she did not get back was a beautiful double-cased watch. And this is another view of where the tenant farm is. This is the Elliott burial map. So here's the Bryan house, here's the Bryan tenant farm. Look at all the Confederate graves along the Emmitsburg Road there. Here is an ad that Mrs. Magruder took out in one of 3 of Gettysburg newspapers. Gettysburg had 3 newspapers at the time of the Battle of Gettysburg. This is an ad Mrs. Magruder took out, paid for it. July 30th, 1863, large size double-case watch, link and chain belonging to Captain William T. Magruder, had been killed at Gettysburg in July, thought to have been in the possession of Captain W.D. Nunn, it's actually Nunn, Captain Nunn, of Company B of the 11th Mississippi Regiment, who died on July 13th at the hospital, and who supposedly gave it to someone for safekeeping. The full value of the watch will be given in return, and information greatly received. She puts an ad out in the Gettysburg paper, I want to get the watch back. Thanks, my colleague and I, we got to put a photograph in our book. Guess what, folks? Here's the watch. She got that watch back. So, and there it is. That's the original watch carried by Captain Magruder during the American Civil War. And his wife later on gets remarried. He has some small children there. But this is a man who had fought in a Union uniform on the peninsula, changed sides, dies in Pickett's charge, and his belongings make their way back to his wife and family in Baltimore, Maryland. So, serving under 2 flags, 5 men that fought on both sides of the Civil War, and you thought you knew everything about the American Civil War. You learned some. Hopefully my Gettysburg colleagues learned a little. Thank you so much. I'll be happy to your hand right up, David. I know you're going to be the first question. Go ahead.
I ask this only because it would seem to be a mathematical possibility. Did anyone change sides twice?
I don't know that for certain, but I would have to say yes, that probably occurred. There's a man in World War II I looked up that fought like in 3 different armies in the Second World War. Keep in mind, in the First World War, Italy changes sides, right? It depends on, there are whole countries that change sides. Let's remember. Sometimes we gotta kind of look at what the history is behind it. I can't say for certain I know anyone that fits that criteria, but I would bet money. Yeah.
I wonder if somebody resigned and then followed the Confederacy, gets captured, and becomes a galvanized.
That could happen. Some of these men got Union pensions. I mean, the Confederate. This man that we talked about, Sanders, Joseph Sanders, who fought at the 31st Georgia at Gettysburg, when he comes into the 1st Florida, he actually gets a pension. His wife gets like $8 a month after the Civil War as a Union soldier. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Wayne, you mentioned one gentleman was last in his class.
Yeah.
That always sounds so terrible. Do we know how many people started the class?
That number, I don't know it, but that number is known. The graduates were 44 in that class, and they usually start far more than 44. I tell everybody, I'm glad it's not me going, you know what we call him? We call him a graduate. He's still a graduate. So I'm not exactly sure how many people started that class. That's a known number, though. They
quite
try
so bad to be the last in your class, considering probably half the people dropped out.
Yeah, now that's the day of graduation. And keep in mind, when you're at the United States Military Academy, Naval Academy, your graduation record not only depends on your academic record, it depends on your conduct record. So how many demerits you have, that all figures in to where your overall ranking shows up. So the washout rate, that's known. In the Civil War, the washout rate is a lot higher prior to the Civil War than it is today. Go to the military academies today, washout rate is much lower. There's a lot of work that goes into who we're going to get to go to these places. Many of these men that went to the military academy prior to the Civil War, during the Civil War are academically unprepared. They come from places that don't have a lot of formalized schooling, unless your family could send you to private schools to be tutored. One of the men that is up here went to Princeton. He didn't graduate from Princeton, but he went to Princeton before he went over to West Point. It's not unheard of. And Georgetown is a prep school. A lot of them go to Georgetown, then they go up to West Point. So today, it's different. At the time of the Civil War, the academic preparation, schooling for some of these people was not up to snuff, or it needed to be. Yes, sir?
Wayne, you think that it's stiff because he was the last Confederate to die, that they honored him in that way, where he was buried at a higher level?
Well, he's not the last Confederate to die in Texas. He's the last in his class. He was the last of the class of 1850. And when he dies, he's over 90. And there is an obituary of him that's a pretty extensive obituary. As far as I know, he's never married and never has any children. He has a niece and nephew in St. Louis, Missouri, according to the home records that are there. But he's not the last one to be in the home. So I don't think that quite, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And even the people that went to visit, the people at the cemetery, I sent my friends down there, they went to the cemetery people and said, where's this guy's grave? And the cemetery people looked him up and said, gee, he dies on the 18th of March, he's buried on the 18th of March. That's because when you're 90-some years old, there's nobody to come to your funeral anyway, right? So they bury him, they're gonna bury him the same day, and you wonder why they put him out here, and even the people at the cemetery didn't know the answer to that question. Yeah, they just thought it was unusual, and it is unusual, considering all the Confederates are buried elsewhere. Yes, sir?
What's the book you co-authored on Magruder, and also the book on Pickett's Charge?
Yeah, the book on Pickett's Charge that Jim and I co-authored, Pickett's Charge, the greatest attack in American history, I think we called it, didn't we, Jim? You don't know the title of your own book, you're trouble.
On sale in the bookstore.
It's in the bookstore. Get it there and support the museum. But Magruder is pictured in there. There's not a separate biography on any of these men that I'm talking about. And probably Manning, there's probably more on him than others because he dies in 1916, and his son is an admiral, and his grandson dies in World War II. There's probably more on him maybe than the others. But there's no specific book on all these people together. Yeah. The Pickett's Charge book, we put Magruder in our book because we had to photograph, we had to watch, we had these things. Yeah. Yes, Larry?
Hey, Wayne, would you say that many of the Confederate soldiers who moved into the Union ranks at one point, could they possibly have been Unionists, conscripted against their will, and when the opportunity arose, they were able to...
Sure. I mean, and that's a high possibility. And then there are other cases where you say, do you want to get paroled, sign the oath of allegiance, or do you want to stay in POW camp? And I don't know, Larry, if everybody, there is a book out there called The Galvanized Yankees. There's stuff written about these units, these 6 units that were recruited at the federal level. There's some state units too that were sent out to the West, and mostly in the Confederate Army, the way I understand it, if you're a Union prisoner and you take the oath for the Confederacy and you fight in the Confederate Army, they put you right against the Union forces. They put you right against the men that you just left. And I don't know what happened here, and I'm not sure. There's probably, you could study desertion rates on that too, because I'm sure some of these men wanted to get back to the units that they were assigned to. You just never know, what the situations are. And my point in telling you this is I don't think it's a cut and dry. If it was cut and dry, we would look at William Thomas Magruder and we could say, you know what? The Emancipation Proclamation was cut just right before he resigned, and that's the reason why he resigned. It's not clear that that is exactly what occurred. Could be, but it's not completely clear. Yeah. All right, well, listen, I want to make an announcement before you go, and that is the next presentation that we're going to have for our monthly lecture series will be in this room. It'll be on the 23rd of March, I believe. Check the website for that. It will be Gary Edelman, the Director of History Education at the American Battlefield Trust, formerly Civil War Trust. He's going to do the whole Civil War in photographs in 45 minutes. And if you know Gary Edelman, he talks faster than I do. He doesn't need 45 minutes to cover all that. He'll be here. And on March 30th, we're going to have a special kickoff lecture and book signing on the 30th of March by Dr. James Broomall at the Shepherd University George Tyler Moore Center Studies for the Civil War. He's got a brand new book coming out. It's a Gettysburg-related book on the Civil War about soldiers and after the war, and he's going to unveil that book and give a talk right here at the museum on the 30th. So for March, we're going to have two special lectures that will be here. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to compliment you on the primary sources that you displayed up there. I think it was excellent.
I thank you very much. I appreciate that. So this is supposed to be my job, so I'm supposed to be working on these things. And the problem is, I like doing this so much, everybody's got to remind me. Some of the board members are here, and they got to remind me what my job, what I need to do. I get my refresher, I get my boost when I get to come out and give a presentation for all of you. I just can't thank you all enough for honoring the museum and helping. If you want to help the museum, you're not a member here, go over and take out a membership here, because these things cost funds. Luckily, we've got our sponsors here at the National Civil War Museum to help us out. All of you, we want to educate 43,000 people a year on the Civil War. That's what we do here. 4,000 or 5,000 of these are children, school-age children. And everybody here knows that education is so necessary for all of us here when it comes to the history of this great country. So we hope you have a great Saturday afternoon. Thanks so much for coming out.